Hello, everyone. So excited you could join us today for another UVA Club event. Today are the UVA Club of Charlottesville in collaboration with the UVA Club of Fairfield, Westchester, is having a Zoom event featuring Linda Lakhdhir, who is the um, advisor to Human Rights Watch for the Asia Division. Linda will discuss the current situation in Myanmar and the coup, the consequences of the coup, and the international reaction to the situation. I just want to tell you before we start a little bit about our club in Charlottesville. Our club exists under the direction of the Office of Engagement. It's one of 100 clubs nationally and internationally. We offer a variety of events, athletics, social, service, book club, happy hours, everything to connect the community with the university and to keep everyone engaged. In addition, we have a scholarship. We give a $500 scholarship every year to a local student, which usually is a very big help for their books or anything else in addition to whatever else the university is giving them. This year, we were fortunate enough, due to many of our events, that we raised more money and we gave two such scholarships. So we really thank you who have participated and donated. And if you'd like to do so in the future, please do. If you'd like to get involved in one of the clubs, whether in your region or in Charlottesville, please let us know. Go to the website or call the Office of Engagement to find out how you could find us. We're all on Facebook, so you can join us there. Ron of the Fairfield Westchester Club will give you a little talk as well and tell you about his region. And thank you, Ron, for helping me put this event together. And thank you, Linda, for coming to speak to us.
Thanks, Barbara. I'm Ron Jaffa, president of the UVA Club of Fairfield, Westchester. I'd first like to thank Barbara for including our club as part of this event, and Linda for appearing today. Linda has a connection to Connecticut, currently living here and having spent time in the past in Westport. So we're happy that she was able to spare some time for us today. Likewise, our club is very active. We're looking forward to getting back to live programming again. So for those members who have signed up for the program today, and I did see a bunch of names I recognized from our area, check your emails in the coming months, game watches, museum visits, other programming. So we're hoping to get back to being very active as we were before. Likewise, we have a very robust scholarship program, Melissa Holland Scholarship. Every spring, we give out anywhere from 2 to 3 scholarships up to $12,000 in total. So we're happy to have people contribute to that through our club if that's something that is what people want to do. But again, thanks to Barbara. Thank you, Linda. And I'll pass it over to Linda, and looking forward to hearing her program. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody for joining. As Barbara said, I'm Linda Lakhdhir, and I'm a legal advisor in the Asia Division of Human Rights Watch. And I am going to be talking about Myanmar. So in 2015, Myanmar held what was widely viewed as its first free and fair elections after more than 50 years of what was effectively military rule. The National League for Democracy, which was headed by Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi, won a landslide victory, taking nearly 80% of the contested seats and winning a clear majority in both houses. And many hoped this would be the beginning of a new era for the country. Less than 6 years later, Myanmar is in the midst of a political and a humanitarian crisis. On February 1st, 2021, the Myanmar military staged a coup and arrested Aung San Suu Kyi, President Win Myint, and many state and regional chief ministers. They set up a state administrative council made up of military figures to run the country, and claimed the coup was necessary because there had been massive electoral fraud in elections held in November 2020. Elections once again overwhelmingly won by the National League for Democracy. Since then, security forces have attempted to crush opposition to the coup, killing more than 1,000 of their own citizens and arresting more than 7,000. The economy is in tatters, and COVID is decimating the population. So what happened, and how did we get from 2015 to here, and what does the future hold? And that's sort of what I'm going to talk about today. Recent events mirror in many ways Myanmar's past. Over the years, Myanmar's military, called the Tatmadaw, has alternated between full-blown military rule and efforts to legitimize or soften that rule through largely superficial liberalization and managed elections, all the while retaining a hold on power. Given the parallels, I'm going to start with about 5 minutes just talking about Myanmar history. And I apologize for those of you who already are familiar with Myanmar history, but I think it's difficult to understand what's happening and what the future is likely to hold without understanding the Tatmadaw's outsized role in history and how it's held its power for so long. After independence, Myanmar had only 14 years of civilian rule before its first military coup by General Ne Win in March 1962. In what would become a pattern for the future, he dissolved parliament and state legislatures, he arrested political leaders, he cracked down on freedom of speech and freedom of the press to essentially repress anti-coup sentiment. And while he claimed that civilian rule would quickly be restored, he would go on to rule Myanmar for more than 25 years. Instead of truly restoring civilian rule, in 1971, he changed his uniform for civilian clothes. He oversaw the drafting of a new constitution by a party he headed. He got it approved in a strictly controlled vote, and he then became the president of the country. And he held that position for 17 years of repressive rule. He didn't step down until July 1988 in the face of the first of the major uprisings against military rule. Those protests, which started in response to a demonetization program that had wiped out the savings of much of the population with a particularly devastating impact on students, continued even after his resignation. And they were calling at that point for an end to military rule and a transition to democracy. On August 8, 1988, riot police and the military crushed the uprising with extreme force, killing at least 3,000 protesters and shutting down the universities for months. Many of the student activists fled the country rather than risk arrest, and many spent years in exile or hiding out near the borders of the country. Others were arrested and spent years in prison. And on September 18th of that year, the military, headed now by General Saw Maung, declared martial law under the leadership of an 18-member group called the State Law and Order Restoration Council, or SLORC, and the country was once again under open military rule. It was during this period that Aung San Suu Kyi, who is the daughter of independence figure General Aung San, first gained prominence as a pro-democracy leader. She gave her first public speech in August of 1988 during these protests, and she helped to found the National League for Democracy in September of that year. Over the next 6 months, membership in the National League for Democracy soared, and Suu Kyi spoke out repeatedly against the junta. But in July 1989, the junta struck back, and she was arrested on spurious charges and sentenced to house arrest. She would ultimately spend much of the next 15 years under house arrest. At the time of the coup, Saw Maung had claimed, as had Ne Win, that civilian rule would be restored. He said it would be restored in 2 years after an election that was to be held in 1990. In the run-up to the election, SLORC's hand-picked election commission imposed many, many rules that were essentially intended to thwart campaigning by the opposition, and particularly campaigning by the National League for Democracy. But despite the restrictions, the National League for Democracy scored an overwhelming electoral victory in the 1990 elections. However, rather than hand over power, SLORC annulled the election results and rounded up and arrested many NLD leaders, party activists, and others, just as happened this year. SLORC would essentially rule the country for the next 20 years, although it changed its name in 1997 to the slightly more palatable State Peace and Development Council. So again, these were many years of repression under essentially military governments. The next major flashpoint was 2007 with the so-called Safran Revolution. In August of that year, a massive increase in fuel prices sparked protests that the government quickly suppressed. But in September, monks began protesting in large numbers. It's why it's called the Safran Revolution, after the saffron color of their robes. Those protests grew in size until on September 26th, the military, as usual, responded with brutal violence. They shot into crowds with live ammunition and rubber bullets. They beat marchers and monks. They arbitrarily detained thousands of people in official and unofficial places of detention. Many were killed, and many of those that were detained were sentenced to decades-long prison terms after unfair trials. Facing renewed criticism after this crackdown and international calls for democratic reform, in October 2007, the SPDC announced that it was creating a commission that would draft a new constitution, which would be followed by elections. In February of 2008, they announced the Constitution was ready, and they scheduled a vote to approve this Constitution for May 2008. But on May 2nd of that year, just 8 days before the scheduled vote, Cyclone Nargis slammed into the country, killing at least 140,000 people. Following the storm, more than 2 million people were in desperate need of food, of clothing, clean water, and shelter. But despite this devastation, the SBTC announced the referendum vote would continue as scheduled. The vote, in which the new Constitution was approved, was denounced internationally as neither free nor fair, with massive voting irregularities and outright fraud. This Constitution, which was essentially drafted by the military to ensure that it retained significant power regardless of the outcome of elections, is the Constitution that continues to govern the country even today. And that's just really important to understand. Under the Constitution, the military is entitled to 25% of the seats in each of the legislative bodies, the upper and lower house of the Union legislature and each of the legislatures of the regions and states. Those seats are filled with sitting members of the military appointed by the commander-in-chief. While the 25% allocation is obviously not sufficient to block ordinary legislation, it does allow the military to prevent any changes in this Constitution they drafted, because changes in the Constitution require more than 75% of the vote of those in Parliament. The military also has significant power in the executive branch. Under the Constitution, the commander-in-chief has the power to appoint the ministers of defense, home affairs, and border affairs, as well as the regional ministers of security and border affairs. And the Ministry of Home Affairs is particularly important because it's responsible for law enforcement, the police force, the special branch, the prison department, and the general administration department. So this means that the military, under this Constitution, essentially controls all of the basic levers of law enforcement and much of the general administration down to the very, village and ward levels. And finally, there's a provision clearly aimed at Aung San Suu Kyi, whose husband and sons have UK citizenship, which bars from the presidency of the country anyone who has family members that owe allegiance to a foreign power. So this was a very carefully crafted constitution that was put in place really to give the military the ability to have elections or quasi-elections without ever really losing their hold on power. So with this new constitution in place, Myanmar moved to hold its first parliamentary elections in 20 years on November 8th, 2010. The NLD boycotted the elections because Aung San Suu Kyi was still under house arrest. Election monitors reported a wide range of abuses, including fraud and coercion, and the results were unsurprising. The military-backed Union Solidarity and Development Party won over 3/4 of the seats available. Following the election, and with this constitution in place, the military went to turn over to this new quasi-civilian government. And on February 4th, 2011, Thein Sein, himself a former senior general who had traded in his uniform for civilian clothes, was made president. And he took full control of the country under the banner of the Union Solidarity and Development Party. Despite his military connections and the role that the military plays under the Constitution, the Thein Sein administration did take some significant steps to reform the country, including loosening restrictions on freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Pre-publication review and censorship was abolished after 48 years of that policy. The government allowed privately owned daily newspapers to operate for the first time in decades and granted licenses to some ethnic media outlets. And exiled media outlets, such as the Democratic Voice for Burma, began operating within the country. In a sign of the changes, in April 2014, Human Rights Watch was able to meet with government officials in the capital of Naypyidaw for the first time ever, and held an actually rather critical press conference in Yangon without issues. But this process of liberalization was uneven, and many people were still being arrested for criticizing the government or criticizing the military. And the ongoing conflict with ethnic groups that had been going on for decades in the border areas continued, often featuring brutal atrocities by the Tatmadaw. So it was an uneven set of reforms, but there were definitely reforms under the Thein Sein administration, which then led to the country holding on November 8th, 2015, full countrywide parliamentary elections that were widely regarded as free and fair. As noted, the NLD won by a landslide, and this time the military, with the 2008 constitution firmly in place to protect itself, did not step in and annul the results. On March 30, 2016, the country swore in its first elected civilian president, Tin Jaw. Aung San Suu Kyi, who as noted was barred from the presidency, was made state councilor, a position created for her by the government. So Despite the limitations imposed by the constitutions, there were many high hopes for the National League for Democracy administration. Countries lifted sanctions that had been placed under military rule, and Aung San Suu Kyi was feted around the world as a democracy icon. But while the country progressed in a range of areas, fundamental problems remained. Most shocking to many was the NLD's acquiescence in and defense of the Myanmar military's brutal campaign against the ethnic Rohingya population in Western Rakhine State. For a little background, the Rohingya are an ethnic minority located primarily in one of the poorest and least developed states in the country. And they were stripped of their citizenship by the 1982 citizenship law and have long been a target of hate campaigns targeting their Muslim faith and claiming that they're really from Bangladesh. Beginning in 2012, the situation worsened with the outbreak of violence between the Rohingya and the ethnic Rakhine and Rakhine State. And Human Rights Watch research at the time found that security forces not only didn't intervene, but were themselves responsible for rape, killings, and mass arrests amounting to crimes against humanity. In the wake of the violence, over 100,000 displaced Rohingya were confined to IDP camps and deprived of freedom of movement, access to education, ability to work, and proper medical care. Rohingya and other parts of the state also suffered discriminatory treatment and lack of access to basic rights. Approximately 120,000 people remain in those camps more than 9 years later in absolutely appalling conditions. In August 2007, a group calling itself the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army attacked a number of border guard posts in Rakhine State. The Tatmadaw responded with a vicious campaign of rape, murder, arson, torture, and other violence. More than 360 Rohingya villages were burned to the ground, and more than 700,000 Rohingya fled to Bangladesh. Human Rights Watch and other organizations, the media, and the UN have documented rapes, killings, and other crimes against humanity. And a UN-backed fact-finding mission found strong evidence that the atrocities were committed with genocidal intent. The NLD-led government not only defended the actions of the military, but persisted in denying the scope of the atrocities. And when the Gambia filed a case against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention, Aung San Suu Kyi personally defended the military's actions in The Hague. This was actually a popular stance in Myanmar, where a long hate campaign has left the Rohingya with few supporters, but was shocking to the international community that had long revered her as an icon of human rights. Even freedom of speech and of the press, something many hoped would improve under the NLD, were not fully realized. In some ways, media and civil society did flourish, but certain topics were very risky. In particular, those speaking critically of the government, of government officials, of the military, or of the atrocities in Rakhine State frequently found themselves arrested and prosecuted, including journalists. In the most well-known case, 2 Reuters journalists were sentenced to 7 years in prison under the Official Secrets Act in apparent retaliation for uncovering a massacre in Inden in Rakhine State. While they were finally released on a pardon, they had to spend more than 500 days in prison. While many of these cases were filed by the military, and many said, this is just the military, it's not the NLD is far from blameless. Not only did they not use their parliamentary majority to change the laws that were being used, but in fact, members of the NLD began using the very same laws against those who criticized them and put in place new laws to restrict freedom of speech. And I guess the other area where there was a lot of disappointment was in trying to resolve the long-standing conflicts in Myanmar's many ethnic areas, where many of the ethnic groups had long been pushing for more autonomy. Aung San Suu Kyi made resolving these conflicts a key element of her election campaign. But the peace process made little headway, and the Tatmadaw continued to commit atrocities in ethnic areas during the years of NLD rule. And trust in the NLD and in Aung San Suu Kyi among some of those groups, which was never very strong, to be honest, quickly waned. But despite these disappointments, Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD remained hugely popular in Myanmar, as evidenced by the outcome of the November 2020 election. As I said, they won more than 80% of the vote, winning 396 out of 496 contested seats. The main opposition party, the military-backed Union Solidarity and Development Party, won only 33 seats, 8 fewer than it did in 2015. They claimed there was widespread election fraud, and the military supported their claim. But both domestic and international election observers said that the result of the election results were credible and reflected the will of the people. So there really is no basis for their claims of massive fraud. We don't know for certain why this election result led the military to stage a coup, but it's clear that they felt weakened rather than strengthened by the results of the election. They have 25% of the seats in each house under the Constitution, but without military-backed parties, the USDP and other parties, having some significant number of seats in parliament to give them a solid voting bloc, that weakened their ability to prevent actions that might threaten either their business interests or their hold on power. Many believe actually that a key factor is Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing. He was facing mandatory retirement from the Army in June 2021 and was reportedly looking to secure a post-retirement position that would protect both the Tatmadaws and his many business interests and protect him from prosecution. Reportedly, he had hoped that he would be president. Facing an election result in which he would not be able to force that role in parliament and apparently unable to get an agreement for that role from the NLD, the military took action on February 1st. As with prior coups, Min Aung Hlaing promised that civilian rule will be restored after elections, initially to be held within 1 year. It seems clear that Tatmadaw thought it would be able to quickly crush any opposition to the coup, as it did in 1988 and 2007 through brute force. And yet, more than 6 months later, the military has failed to solidify its control, the economy is in free fall, and the healthcare system has collapsed. This is due in large part to the bravery of the Myanmar people who have continued to oppose the military takeover in the face of unrelenting brutality. Young people have been at the forefront of opposition to the coup, with women playing a particularly key role. This is basically a generation that grew up with the concept of democratic rule. They have voted, they have had access to information of the world outside of Myanmar, and they appear determined not to allow the country to return to the repression of military rule. There's also been participants in these protests from ethnic groups that have been oppressed by the Tatmadaw for decades. In an odd way, there's been almost a unifying result. This coup has in some ways had a unifying effect on parts of the population. In terms of forms of resistance, first is the civil disobedience movement. Shortly after the coup, doctors and nurses working for government hospitals announced that they were going to refuse to work for the junta, which now obviously controlled government facilities, starting a civil disobedience movement that spread to include a wide range of civil servants, everything from train drivers to engineers to people working for the water system. They're essentially crippling their own economy in an effort to bring down the junta. The junta's response, of course, was to announce arrest warrants for hundreds of those participating in the movement, to evict their families from government housing, and to actually arrest hundreds of CDM participants, including more than 137 doctors and nurses. There were also massive street protests that began shortly after the coup, which continued for quite some time. While the size of these protests has diminished in the face of police brutality and the COVID outbreak, flash protests and other creative forms of dissent continue to occur every day throughout the country, even now 6 months after the coup. A number of the country's many ethnic armed groups have also openly opposed the coup, with all 10 groups that had signed a nationwide ceasefire agreement in 2015 putting out a statement rejecting the junta's nullification of the election results. And many of those groups have stepped up their attacks on the military since the coup. Even Myanmar's representative to the UN, Jo Mo-tun, has failed to fall in line, giving an impassioned speech in the UN General Assembly on February 26, appealing for help to stop the coup. And several of the other diplomatic ambassadors in other countries have also refused to fall in line. So the response has been much stronger and much more long-lasting than the Tatmadaw expected, very clearly. And their response has been, as always, force. They've used live ammunition and rubber bullets to shoot unarmed protesters, in some cases in large numbers. For example, on March 14th in Langtayar Township, Yangon, security forces killed an estimated 58 people. And on April 9th in Bago Township, they killed an estimated 82 people in a dawn assault on the protesters' barricades and encampments. In Sagaing region, which has been a hotbed of resistance, the military has conducted brutal assaults. And there's evidence that they massacred at least 43 civilians in Kani Township in that region in 4 different incidents. The bodies of 43 people have been found, many with their hands tied and showing signs of torture. As of yesterday, security forces have killed more than 1,000 people since the coup, most of whom were unarmed protesters and bystanders. They've killed an estimated 75 children. And according to a local monitoring group, at least 22 people have been tortured to death in custody. Several hundred have been forcibly disappeared, leaving their families uncertain of their fate. And the security forces have arbitrarily arrested more than 7,000 people, more than 5,000 of whom remain in detention. Many of those detained have been subjected to torture or other ill treatment, including routine beatings, burnings from lit cigarettes, prolonged stress positions, mock executions, rape, and gender-based violence. And when security forces can't find their target, they've been arresting family members, including children as young as 4, and essentially holding them as hostages to try and get people to turn themselves in. As is often been the case post-coups, journalists and the media have been a particular target as part of a larger effort to suppress coverage of the military's atrocities. At least five media outlets, including Democratic Voice for Burma, have been banned, and security forces have arrested at least 98 journalists, many of whom remain in detention. This includes American Danny Fenster, who is still in detention. Nathan Mong, another US citizen, has now been released, and he has detailed the ill treatment that he and his coworker Hantayar 9 suffered. Hantayar is unfortunately still in custody. 6 journalists have been convicted and sentenced already, most for violating a newly created provision of the Penal Code that makes it a crime to publish or circulate comments that cause fear or spread false news. In response to the violence of the junta, the opposition is increasingly turning to violence as well. Young people are seeking out military and weapons training from ethnic armed groups and from newly created People's Defense Forces. There have been numerous targeted assassinations of those working for or viewed as informing for the junta. There have been attacks on facilities associated with the junta. There's been increased fighting between the military and those of the ethnic armed groups that oppose the coup, and also the People's Defense Forces, and attacks on military positions by these new People's Defense Forces. The military has responded in some areas with airstrikes, heavy artillery, and ground offensives that have left more than 220,000 people displaced, many hiding in the jungle and in dire need of food, medicine, and shelter. On the political front, the junta is moving to normalize its control and to lay the groundwork for managed elections that they're sure they can win. In July, the hand-picked election commission formally annulled the results of the November elections on the asserted grounds of fraud. And on August 1st, which was the 6-month anniversary of the coup, Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing announced that the junta was extending the emergency for 2 more years and forming a caretaker government, of which he was the prime minister. He said elections would be held in August 2023. So now 2.5 years rather than the original 1 year after the coup. And those elections, if they occur, will clearly be designed to ensure that the military-backed parties win. They're working to exclude Aung San Suu Kyi and other key leaders of the NLD from competing in any election. They've arrested more than 300 members of the NLD, including 98 elected MPs, and they've filed multiple trumped-up criminal charges against them that will likely see them jailed for decades. Obviously, if they're in prison, they can't run for election. There's also clear signs that they're looking for a way, and likely will find some basis, real or not, to dissolve the NLD entirely so that the NLD cannot compete in any elections that they hold. And finally, the hand-picked Union Election Commission, which already annulled the November election, is the one that is going to set the election rules and the campaign rules. So any elections to be held under these circumstances is absolutely certain to be rigged in their favor. And if the effort fails and an opposition party wins, there's no assurance they won't simply annul the election results as they have twice before. So promises of elections by this military government are not something that anyone should rely on. Those elected in November have worked hard to create essentially an alternative power structure or parallel government. A few days after the coup, a group of MPs who had been elected in November created the committee representing the Pidansu Hluttaw, which is the parliament. This is usually referred to as the CRPH. And on April 19th, they formally announced the establishment of a national unity government, which was aimed at bringing together opponents to military rule. It includes NLD parliamentarians elected in November, anti-coup protest leaders, and representatives of ethnic minority organizations. They're pushing countries to recognize and engage with the national unity government and not to recognize the State Administrative Council or the caretaker government that is currently in place. While they have yet to gain formal recognition from any government, they have briefed the UN Security Council, Japanese MPs, and other groups. And members of the national unity government have been very vocal and public in the discussions about what's happening in Myanmar. For example, within the last 2 weeks, 2 members of the US administration have met, at least virtually, with members of the National Unity Government. Wendy Sherman, the Deputy US Secretary of State, met with the NUG's designated foreign minister, and the US Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenwood, met virtually with the head of the NUG COVID-19 response team. There has not been formal recognition, but that there is engagement. And this engagement plays into the ongoing debates of who should be allowed to appoint those that represent Myanmar in international and regional bodies, most crucially at the UN. The UN will be sitting in September. Currently, John Motun, who is the representative of the NLD government, is still in place, but the military has named their own candidate who they say should be allowed to represent the government, and that is something that will be decided by the UN in September. Just to say, recognition of governments or who represents the government is a political issue, not a human rights issue. And it's not something on which Human Rights Watch takes a position. What we can and do say is that the junta overthrew the government elected by the people in violation of their right to choose their own government, and that the results of the November election should be respected. I would also note that the NUG stated positions are actually more inclusive than those espoused by the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi, which is part of this question of whether this coup is in a way maybe going to break down some of the divisions in the country or succeed in unifying some groups that previously were not really working together. On March 31st, the NUG released a 20-page federal democracy charter as a framework for a new government and an interim constitution. Actually, it was released by the CRPH. But the goals include ultimate abolishment of the 2008 Constitution and building a federal democratic union. It includes rights for all minorities, including the Rohingya, unlike under the NLD government, and it speaks of a federal system, which is something ethnic minority groups in the country have been fighting for decades. The junta has declared both the NUG and the CRPH to be terrorist organizations, and they're using this to justify the arrest and detention of supporters of those groups. They recently announced, for example, that 63 prominent figures who had changed their Facebook profile to say support the NUG are being charged under the Anti-Terrorism Act. They've also said they'll arrest all of those who support a lottery being held by the NUG to raise money for those participating in the civil disobedience movement, saying that they could not take responsibility for the consequences that occur during interrogation, which is a pretty threatening statement given the brutality that has occurred during interrogation of those previously arrested. And in the midst of all of this, COVID has come roaring back with devastating impact. The official death toll is more than 14,000, but that's clearly an undercount, as large numbers are dying at home without ever being diagnosed. Prior to the coup, COVID had been fairly well controlled in Myanmar. The country had obtained vaccinations, started a vaccination program in January, focusing on frontline workers. But since the coup, the vaccination program has essentially fallen apart, and the medical system, already weak, has come close to crumbling. Most who become ill are unable to get into a hospital, or in many cases unwilling to seek hospital treatment because the hospitals are under government control and they fear arrest or abuse by the military. The oxygen shortage has led to desperate pleas for oxygen as people seek to treat their family members at home. And in response, the junta banned oxygen suppliers from selling to private individuals or clinics and began seizing the available oxygen supply. They've also raided informal clinics where CDM doctors have been trying to treat patients and have attacked and arrested ambulance workers. They're essentially weaponizing COVID for their own purposes. There have also been COVID outbreaks in the prisons, holding political prisoners, with at least one senior NLD figure already dying of COVID in prison and others reportedly ill. Thousands of people essentially are dying needlessly as a result of this coup, not just from COVID, but from treatable and preventable illnesses that are not being treated as a result of the breakdown of the medical system and the attacks on medical workers. And it is feared that also starvation is going to become an issue, with people out of work and people hiding and unable to access aid. So what will happen? Where are we going? And what should the international community do? And the outcome of the coup is in the hands of the people of Myanmar. But there are things that the international community can and should do to support those fighting for a restoration of democracy. And while some countries have taken positive steps, the overall response has failed to rise to the gravity of the situation. One thing the international community shouldn't do is defer to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, a regional grouping of which Myanmar is a member, to resolve the situation, which unfortunately is what many of them are doing. ASEAN is a body whose chief principle is non-interference in the internal affairs of its other members. And its members include some notoriously non-democratic countries such as Cambodia, and countries such as Thailand that are themselves governed by a former military general who took power in a coup and then held managed elections to become prime minister. It's true to form, when ASEAN held a special meeting in April on Myanmar, a meeting to which Men Online was invited to represent Myanmar, it couldn't even agree to a call for release of political prisoners. The main outcome was a 5-point consensus that included the cessation of violence, reconciliation through constructive dialogue, the appointment of a special envoy from ASEAN to mediate between the parties, safe passage of humanitarian aid, and a visit by ASEAN's envoy to Myanmar. Min Aung Hlaing, who purportedly agreed to this consensus at the meeting in Jakarta, walked back from it only days after the meeting, saying that these were recommendations and that the military would move at its own pace. And certainly the violence has not ceased. There has not been safe passage of humanitarian aid. And it took ASEAN more than 4 months to even appoint its special envoy. When they finally did, about 2 weeks ago, they chose the second foreign minister of Brunei, itself far from a model of democracy, as their envoy. The junta, which agreed to the appointment, immediately objected to the envoy having meetings with any representatives of the National Unity Government, or the CRPH, despite the fact that the consensus calls for the envoy to meet all parties. So few have any hope that the envoy will successfully mediate a resolution to the crisis. And yet, many countries, including the US, including the UK, continue to talk about this 5-point consensus and defer to ASEAN. As one senior US diplomat told the UN in late July, the military has explicitly said it doesn't plan to honor the commitments it made in Jakarta at this meeting. So what are we waiting for? The longer we delay, the more people die. The world needs to stop deferring to ASEAN, and it needs to act. So what should they be doing? That's obviously the big question. What is most crucial right now, given the COVID crisis, is humanitarian support for those suffering both from COVID and from hunger and medicine shortages due to displacement and the actions of the junta. This actually creates somewhat of a dilemma. Many countries have been trying to be careful not to recognize or engage with the junta for fear of legitimizing it in any way. And yet, it's going to be very difficult in many cases to get aid in without in some ways engaging with that government. So it's somewhat of a moral dilemma that countries are navigating in different ways. Last week, the US announced a $50 million in humanitarian aid for things like emergency food assistance, safe drinking water, mobile medical clinics, essential shelter. According to the announcement, this aid is going to be provided cross-border through INGO and NGO partners, indicating that they are trying not to go through the junta. On Wednesday, at a funding conference, ASEAN and many of its partners, including the EU, pledged something like $9 million in humanitarian aid, which is going to be channeled through ASEAN's AHA Center, which is their coordinating body for humanitarian assistance. It's unclear exactly how this aid will be distributed or whether the junta will have a say. But given the fact that members of the junta have participated in several ASEAN meetings already, it seems likely they will have some control over how the money is spent, to the likely detriment, unfortunately, of the civilian population. In addition to humanitarian aid, the international community needs to take concrete steps to impose real consequences on the military, primarily cutting off their access to arms and to funding. Without strong, concerted, and immediate action, the military will continue to oppress and to kill its own people. A considerable number of states, including the US, the EU, Canada, and Australia, have long-standing arms embargoes in place against Myanmar, but others, particularly Russia and China, continue even now to sell them arms. In late July, after much of the violence had already taken place, Russia delivered 6 military aircraft to Myanmar, aircraft that will almost certainly be used to bomb the civilian population. While the UN Security Council has failed to act for fear of a veto by China and Russia, in June, the UN General Assembly issued a non-binding resolution calling for a stop to the flow of arms to Myanmar and urging the military to respect the November election results and release political detainees. Interestingly, only one country, Belarus, voted against the resolution. 36, including China, Russia, and India, abstained, but didn't vote against it. So the UN Security Council should follow up on this resolution by tabling its own resolution to impose a legally binding arms embargo. No one should be selling weapons to a military that is clearly going to use them against its own people. We also need strong coordinated sanctions on the military leaders and the business entities that fund them and fund the junta's atrocities. The military and its generals derive actually an enormous, much off the books income from its many business interests that it's built up over its many decades in power. Many of these are linked to 2 large conglomerates called MEC and MEL. They also derive a lot of money from extractive industries, jade, timber, oil and gas. And this has been going on for years. By far their largest source of foreign currency income is gas revenues, which totals about $1 billion annually in duties, taxes, royalties, and other profits. The US, the UK, and the EU have issued sanctions against MEC and MEL and against some of the entities funneling money from natural resources, but they haven't yet taken any steps to target the gas revenues. Countries need to look to block payments to the junta and state-owned enterprises from foreign-financed gas projects. You have groups such as PTT from Thailand, Total from France, Chevron from the US, who are involved in gas projects in Myanmar. They need to find ways to block the junta's access to that money while allowing for continued production of gas so that electricity in the country is not cut off. Really, we need to cut off the funding to have any possibility of impact. Finally, it's absolutely critical that the Tatmadaw, which has committed atrocities with impunity for more than 60 years, is finally held to account for its actions. And there's been some starts on this front. Myanmar is not a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, but Bangladesh is. So the ICC prosecutor has started an investigation looking into the crime of forced deportations into Bangladesh, looking at the way in which the Rohingya were forced out of Myanmar and into Bangladesh in 2017. As I mentioned earlier, the International Court of Justice is hearing a case under the Genocide Convention that was filed by the Gambia. And a court in Argentina recently started considering an application to open a case against Min Aung Hlaing and other senior officials using the theory of universal jurisdiction, and has been having some hearings to decide whether or not to take that case or not in recent days. It's crucial that these efforts continue and that they're supported by the international community. But the UN Security Council should also refer Myanmar to the International Criminal Court so that the prosecutor can consider the full range of international crimes committed in the country. And just to clarify, the UN Security Council can refer Myanmar to the criminal court, even if Myanmar is not a party to the Rome Statute. That's why you need the Security Council to act. So far, they have not done that, again, fearing a veto by Russia and China. But it's important that accountability take place, because without accountability, with years of impunity, there is nothing really to stop the Myanmar military from continuing the way that has gone for decades. In this case, failure to act could have really devastating consequences. The risk of outright civil war in Myanmar is real, and the risk of millions of deaths due to COVID, starvation, and preventable disease is even more real. The junta thinks they can wait this out. They basically think the opposition will ultimately crumble under the combination of security force violence, arrests, imprisonment, and COVID, and that the international community will stop short of taking the kinds of actions that will actually have an impact. So far, the opposition is proving them wrong, but they need support if they're going to continue to do that. And that support includes strong, concerted action against the military by the international community. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take questions. On the ones you sent me, the first question is there a realistic democratic progression after the one-year military seizure expires? I think I've already largely addressed that. First, they've now extended their seizure to 3 years instead of 2 years. But I think actually that a true election, democratic election, even at the end of the 3 years, is highly unlikely given their history and given the procedures that they've put in place. What effect, if any, will public disapproval of the coup have on the ongoing genocide against the Rohingya? And that's a very interesting question. I mean, I think there's a bunch of different kinds of impacts. I mean, one thing that's been very interesting is to see how the actions of the Tatmadaw have essentially changed the attitude of large parts of the population towards the Rohingya. The Rohingya were fairly despised by large parts of the population, based in large part on this longstanding hate campaign. And I, have talked to activists, human rights defenders for years who would say when they spoke up in defense of the Rohingya, they would be attacked by others in the country. Even democracy activists would attack them for their support of the Rohingya. And I think that's really changing. I think people are now seeing that the Tatmadaw is acting against the Bamar majority population in the same way that they've acted against ethnic groups, including the Rohingya, for years. And there's a new sympathy for and understanding that this has been used to divide the population. So, the fact that the NUG is talking about potentially having a Rohingya representative is sort of symbolic of that shift. On the other hand, for those Rohingya who are still in Rakhine State, this is obviously not helping their situation at all, because the military that has been oppressing them is now fully in charge, well, not fully in charge, but is technically in charge of the country. So for those in the IDP camps, for those who are still in Rakhine State, for those who are in Bangladesh and hoping to return to Myanmar, this is actually really a big step backwards and is not going to help the situation. Do we trust that a democratic government is even possible in Myanmar? I think, yes, I think we do, but I think only if fundamental things change. And unfortunately, the military has had a very, very long time to put in place, as I said, things like the Constitution that give them these powers that fundamentally undermine democracy. And one of my fears is that while they do have power, they may do things like change the Constitution even further to give themselves, essentially entrench themselves even more and make it even harder for democracy to take hold, even if you can have a free and fair election, as was done in 2015 and 2020. But certainly there are many, many people in Myanmar who want, support, are pushing for true democracy in the country. And, I certainly am not willing to say that they can't ever get it. I just think it's a hard road. How do we move forward and interact with this government given the atrocities they've committed? Well, first, I don't call them government. They are a junta. They have taken control by force. They are not the elected government of the country. And many countries are trying not to engage with them. Many countries are actually affirmatively not using their titles, trying not to invite them to things. Depending on how long this goes on, again, there may be some pragmatic decisions that countries may make. But I think certainly one thing that everyone who engages with this junta, to the extent they do, needs to continually reinforce that they need to step back and that they need to respect rights.
We have a couple other questions, Linda, that people wrote in. Does China's growing global influence curb the overall response by various governments and international bodies in the call to restore democracy?
Well, certainly fear of a veto at the UN Security Council by China is one of the things that has prevented countries in the Security Council from tabling resolutions to condemn the coup unequivocally, to call for a binding arms embargo, or to refer the country to the ICC. So fear of their veto power is certainly playing a role. There has long been this dynamic or this discussion on Myanmar that you have to be careful because you're going to push Myanmar into the arms of China. Certainly China is, more than most countries, openly embracing the junta or acknowledging the junta as the government of the country. They have a lot of investments in Myanmar, and they are working to protect those investments. It's interesting, though, that at the same time, they are providing vaccinations to some of the ethnic armed groups to vaccinate people in their areas, because those are areas that actually border on China, and China's worried about the COVID from within Myanmar spreading back into China. So China is it's a very complex, its relations with Myanmar. But yes, I do think that fear of China's power does play a role in how the international community is reacting.
Wow. How also does the ongoing political development in Myanmar line up with the increase in authoritarian trends we see in governments around the world? Are they more empowered because of all of the things that are happening in other countries, even democratic countries?
Absolutely, they're fitting into a trend. And I think, for example, it's been reported that Min Aung Hlaing spoke to Prayut Chan-o-cha, the Prime Minister of Thailand, either before or just after the coup. And for those who are not familiar, Thailand had its own coup in 2014. They then had fairly managed elections in which the constitution gave particular power to the military-backed parties, and Prayut, who was the general, is now the prime minister. So, it's the kind of transition that Min Aung Hlaing wants to make, and he consulted with Thailand about it. So there is that. And I think in general, certainly particularly in Asia, the rise of authoritarianism has been really striking in the last year. And each one empowers the others. It's like they got away with it, why can't I? And I have to say that the claims of election fraud coming in the face of the claims of election fraud in the US was a little bit of an echo that was really troubling to hear. So yeah.
Do you feel the current administration in DC is doing all it can do, and what can we do to encourage them to do something more?
I mean, they have been taking steps. I mean, as I said, they've been engaging with the National Unity Government. They are trying to get aid in. They have been reasonably vocal. I don't know that they have pushed as hard as they can or should at the Security Council or generally in the UN. I actually, to be honest, really fear that the current crisis in Afghanistan is going to push Myanmar to the bottom of the agenda, and that country's going to stop paying attention. And that is going to be tragic for the people of Myanmar if that happens. In terms of what we can do, I mean, obviously people can write to their congresspeople or their senators. They can, speak up and just try and keep this on the agenda, because there is a real risk with everything happening in the world, particularly Afghanistan, where the US has so much, money and manpower and years of invested. Everyone's going to take their eye off the ball. So anything that can be done to keep it in the spotlight is really important.
You said that there's a humanitarian crisis and it's obvious. Is there also a refugee crisis and is it spilling over to Bangladesh? And also, how are they dealing with it if it is?
It's not spilling so much to Bangladesh. I mean, Bangladesh has a refugee crisis with those who came over in 2017, but those who are fleeing now have largely not been going to Bangladesh. They've been going to India. There's been a lot of people spilling over into India, where there was at one point a move by India to push them back that got met with a lot of international resistance. And at this point, India is, I think, not pushing them back. And there's been a lot of spillover into China and into Thailand. Both of those countries are trying to prevent that spillover by really enforcing their borders. And they claim that that is because of fear of COVID, which, to be honest, is a legitimate fear, but is also meaning that they are working to prevent people from crossing into their country, even when they're basically, fleeing in fear of their lives. So at the most, right now, a lot of the people who have fled have actually gone into India.
Yeah, that's really, it's a little depressing, the last two things you talked about. Other than that, maybe you can give us a little idea of how Human Rights Watch has been helping and supporting the situation and what you guys are still doing and will be doing. Maybe that will make us feel better that there's at least something going on out there.
I mean, most of what we do is we document what happens. We make sure that there's documentation. And then obviously we advocate with governments to try and get them to take action. There's not much that we can, on the ground do to make things change other than to document what's happening and to push governments for change. And that is what we do. We have actually a pretty significant team by our standards working on Myanmar, and have been for quite a few years. And we are trying to really carefully document the killings and the torture and the arrests and the brutality that's taking place, so that hopefully in the future there can be accountability for that. We are advocating very strongly at the United Nations with the countries that are, also at countries in capitals about what they do at the United Nations, to try and press the United Nations to take a much more active role in what's happening in Myanmar. We are doing advocacy with countries, both on sanctions and arms embargoes and what pressures they can bring. So I guess that's pretty much it.
Well, that is a lot of stuff, and maybe we can all just take a minute to make a call or write a note and keep it in the forefront of the politicians' stack of to-dos and all the things. I agree with you about. Afghanistan is going to definitely take a lot of this off the top of their list, and that's very, very sad, because the crisis isn't going to wait for us to pay attention again. That's for sure. Linda, I thank you so much. You were so gracious with your time and doing this and having something really, really well thought out and prepared for us. I wish you, all the best in the work that you do. Thank you for the work that you do. We appreciate you coming to UVA clubs to discuss it, and hope that other people will watch it later and really, keep it in the forefront of their mind. We appreciate you being here. Thank you everyone for checking in, and thanks Ron for helping me put this together.
Thanks for having me on.
Have a wonderful day. Bye.
Bye.